And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce and welcome to York St. John through the power of Zoom, Peggy Grande. Peggy Grande was an executive assistant to US President Ronald Reagan from 1989 to 1999 after he left the White House. So Peggy knew President Reagan personally, knew Mrs. Reagan as well. So Peggy is the author of the book, The President Will See You Now, My Stories and Lessons from Ronald Reagan's Final Years, which is here. So I wholeheartedly—
Thank you for the shout out. Appreciate
no worries,
it.
I wholeheartedly recommend this. Fantastic read. I'll talk more about it in a few moments. Peggy is an international keynote speaker, TV and radio commentator, and widely published opinion writer. She was chair of World for Brexit and was national spokesperson for California Ballot Initiative. Peggy served as a presidential appointee for the Trump administration and considers it the honor of a lifetime to have worked for two presidents of the United States. I think you're in probably a very exclusive company. I feel up there with like perhaps Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld. Is it Richard David Gergen who's on CNN a lot of the time? People who've served multiple presidents, just very, so you've got so much experience to hear about. And Peggy's also worked on various boards, appointees. So she serves on the board of Pepperdine University School of Public Policy and the board of the Center for American Ideas. And you're a graduate of Pepperdine University and the mother of four. And of course, the book is wonderful to read about how your children got to interact with President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan as well. So I think, and obviously for anyone who has joined us who doesn't know me, I'm Jim Cooper. I'm an associate professor of history and American Studies at York St. John University. And a number of our audience today are students on our third year module. There's our special subjects, American history, where we're looking at Ronald Reagan and his legacy. So hopefully we get some good questions about Reagan as well from the students. So Peggy, I think to kick off is almost like the classic question: how did this happen for you? How did you end up working for the 40th president of the United States?
Well, first, I want to say thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for your interest in Ronald Reagan. I think he is worthy of that interest, and I hope to pique the interest of your students and those who have joined us online today. It's one of my favorite subjects to talk about, so thank you for giving me the occasion to do so. And for anybody who's logging in who's not politically affiliated or interested, just know that I'm going to talk more about leadership today than about politics. And as much as Ronald Reagan, of course, was known for being a conservative and being aligned with the Republican Party here in the United States, I think now, especially as time goes by, he's widely regarded as an incredible leader and a communicator who was able to inspire people across party lines. And so we're going to be looking at that more than his politics. And so for anybody who has an interest in what leadership looks like at its highest and best, I think Ronald Reagan was a great representative of that. So back to your question, James, and thank you for the great introduction. It was a very only in America story, not unlike Ronald Reagan's to a smaller scale. You know, Ronald Reagan, we think of him as president of the United States, but he was born on the heels of the Great Depression in a very small town in the Midwest. He was born to a family that was very poor. His father was an alcoholic, which not only created all kinds of financial troubles and other things, but at the time it was really stigma and shame. And so you look at somebody like that, he was raised by a mother of faith who taught him to believe that anything was possible. And so his really was an only in America story. Mine not quite as exciting as that, but I grew up in a small town in Southern California, several thousand miles away from Washington, D.C. And so in a very unlikely sequence of events, I found myself working for the President of the United States. As a child, I guess I was kind of that nerdy little kid that loved presidents and politics and government. And while other people were reading about animals or trains or, you know, wanted to be a vet or a teacher, I was reading about presidents and first ladies and studying the White House and studying systems of government. So I was kind of that kid. And my parents didn't really know what to do with me. So of course they sent me regularly to the library. And I read a lot of books about that, never imagining that that would be any part of my life. But fast forward to end of elementary school, junior high, high school, and even some of college, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. And so in those really pivotal and formative years of my own life, I was watching this man as the president of the United States. And really, that was my first interaction with a president at all. You know, you read about him in history books, you see all the little snapshot thumbnail pictures, they all kind of seem the same. But this one was the first one I really paid attention to. I saw him coming through my TV into my living room, and I was captivated by what he said and how he said it. And as a student in college, I didn't study politics or history because I thought, what's the practicality of that? I'll never go into the political arena. So I studied communications. Well, again, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, known across the world as the great communicator. And so I studied many of his speeches as a student and was even more captivated by who he was and how he did what he did. My senior year in Pepperdine, Ronald Reagan actually came to Pepperdine to speak. He had just left the White House. He came there to give an after the administration address to our student body. I got to be in the same, it was like a big basketball arena. And so it was a very large place. I was very far from him, but just the electricity in the air and the excitement of being there was really something that stuck with me even to this day. I remember that feeling. And as I was approaching my final semester that year, Ronald Reagan had left the White House. He had just opened an office in Los Angeles, not far from where I was attending school. And my dad had taught me to believe that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. So I took a chance and I wrote a letter, probably on an old typewriter, to the office of Ronald Reagan, never expecting to even hear back from them. But one day the phone in my dorm room rings and I pick it up, and it's the office of Ronald Reagan calling and asking if I want to come in for an interview. Well, yes, of course. But as soon as I say yes, I'm terrified because I have no idea what I'm going to do or say. My family, we were not wealthy or donor class. We didn't interact with people of stature or power like that. So I was a little nervous, to say the least, but I thought it would be the most exciting day of my life just to step foot on that floor where he worked. So I went to the interview that day, dressed very nicely, of course. I actually was working my way through school, working for a high-end department store here called Nordstrom. So had very nice clothes already, and so felt good about that. But everything else, I had no idea how it was going to go. The interview, though, went really well. At the end of it, I'm going to embarrass myself, but I write about this in my book, as you probably remember reading. At the end of the interview, I'm sitting in the lobby waiting to be taken downstairs and given my parking validations for a very expensive parking lot. I was afraid as a college student I wouldn't even be able to pay to get out of. And through the side doors, walking right toward me, comes Ronald Reagan himself. He's flanked by United States Secret Service. You can see, of course, the guns holstered under their coats. And I go into full panic mode. I don't know what to do. I've never met anybody important like this. I think they probably don't know who I am, what I'm doing there. I'm wondering, are they going to arrest me? Are they going to shoot me? Should I run? Should I hide? What should I do? So in my full panic moment, I think about what I would do if the flag were passing by. And so just being non-threatening and out of respect, I stood up. I placed my hand over my heart and didn't even look at him because I wanted it to be a very non-threatening posture. And so instead of walking right past me, he walked right toward me. He stuck out his hand, he shook my hand. And I will always remember that moment of looking into those sparkling blue eyes, seeing the twinkle in his eyes. He smiled at me, and he didn't need to introduce himself to me, but I introduced myself to him. And it was just a magical moment. So he left with Secret Service. The woman who had interviewed me was standing at the door, watched the whole thing happen, and was laughing at me. And I said, "You should have warned me." And she said, "No, it's better this way." And even though I thought I had terribly embarrassed myself, I loved that moment because so many times over the course of the next 10 years working for him, I saw people have their first meeting and their first moment with Ronald Reagan and watched them respond very much in the same way I did. And so I was actually hired on the spot for what I thought would be a short-term internship as I finished school. But as I graduated from university, the woman who had hired me actually returned to Washington, D.C., and they asked me to take her job. So I served as the executive assistant to the chief of staff for several years. And then Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant, he had had since before he was governor, so many decades, she retired, and they asked me to take that job. And so I served as the executive assistant to Ronald Reagan and worked in his office from 1989 to 1999. When he left the public eye. And then he lived another 5 years after that. And as James knows, I wrote in my book about what those 5 years after he stopped coming to the office were like, and my opportunity to continue to visit with him up to not long before he passed, and to stay connected with Mrs. Reagan until right before she passed away. So 27 years of my life, starting as a very young woman in my 20s, still in university, were kind of intermingled, I guess you could call, and intertwined with the Reagans. And what a privilege and opportunity. I learned so much from him, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit more into that. So that's my story in a nutshell, embarrassing as it is. I think it all worked out for the best in the end.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Peggy. And I think on that note, I think the book itself, it's very personal, isn't it? I think it's not just in almost like the classic memoir of someone who worked with or for the president, which you see so often. It's very much about your family, the chapters towards the end of the president's life. Very, very moving as well. So I think that really kind of comes through the relationship that you have with both the Reagans. And I think obviously, so we know that you get there, you're working for President Reagan. I think often we think about presidents and they do their time in the White House, and then what do they do? So obviously some go on a foundation. Jimmy Carter, of course, is famous as the best ex-president America ever had. How did Ronald Reagan see his role after the White House? Did he have anything he wanted to accomplish? Was he a mentor for his successors, or anyone generally, like in the political arena, for any kind of causes he wanted to advocate? What did he see his role as post White House?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I wrote the book is, people think of him, he left office, he got Alzheimer's, and he died. But there was 15 years in there. So what were those 15 years like? And he went from a staff of thousands to a staff of just a handful of us. And so there were really only a few people, myself included, that could talk about what those years looked like. And former presidents, to your point, they have an opportunity to create the post-presidency that they want. And I know it's very different than how things work there in the UK, where the prime minister leaves and, sometimes returns to parliament, sometimes goes off to do who knows what. But here in the United States, there's this sense of almost obligation still that they will continue to use the privilege and the opportunity that they have had and give back in meaningful ways. And even though those aren't defined, they are provided with Secret Service protection for the rest of their lives, and are given a stipend to set up an office to really conduct the activities that they see suitable. So in Ronald Reagan's case, of course, he wrote a memoir. It's called An American Life. It's a beautiful story in his own voice that he wrote, telling his great all-American story. And so he worked on that. He gave a lot of speeches. He continued to be really involved with the Republican Party. He had a couple of causes that he spoke out, I guess, in favor of. He really wanted to have a balanced budget amendment. There at the time, I think, were 35 governors that had the line item veto, and he wanted that power to be added to the president. He talked about gerrymandering, which is redistricting in a way that provides favorability to one party or the other. And he thought that that really violated the right of people to vote in voting blocks as they choose, because they chose to live in areas like that. And so there were a couple of things like that that he spoke out in favor of or against. But he was always very careful not to backseat drive. And so in his case specifically, George Bush had been his vice president for 8 years and then went on to become president of the United States. And so he was very careful to not speak out on things that George Bush was involved in to make it seem like he was second guessing him, because he really knew that only the president of the United States has all the information accessible. And so he could talk about how it was when he was there, but things may have changed and he might not be fully up to speed. And so it was important to him to allow George Bush to have his space. And that continued whether it was President Clinton or others that came after him, to just let them be the president and for him to do his thing. But he remained a man of conservative principles and values. He continued to speak out for that and advocate for his favorite topic to talk about, which was freedom. He had been a great freedom fighter and had been a happy warrior for freedom all over the world. And so he continued to speak out and support causes like that. And, again, I write in my book about his meetings post-presidency with Gorbachev. And here's somebody who had been a foe across the world, who had somehow, unbelievably so, through diplomatic means that probably only Ronald Reagan could accomplish, this foe had become a friend. And so to watch his relationship with people like Gorbachev or your lady Margaret Thatcher or the Queen even, and prime ministers and presidents from all around the world, Helmut Kohl, Lech Walesa, Prime Minister Nakasone, the King of Jordan, they all, Mother Teresa, they all came through the office in his post-presidency years. And so it was very busy and robust, especially the first 5 years. And then 5 years into his post-presidency, he announces to the world that he has Alzheimer's, and the world in essence starts saying goodbye to him then. But for the next 5 years, I'm still saying good morning to him every day. So I also read about those years and what were those like when we knew that his was a life in decline and that his best days were behind him perhaps, and yet he believed always that America's best days were still ahead.
I think in the book that you talk about how the team you were part of, when the president announces that he has Alzheimer's, the fact you all very quickly move on to, we need to now learn as much about Alzheimer's as possible.
Right.
We need to just be completely there to support President and Mrs. Reagan. So the dedication of the team around. Some people might call it Reagan world, like the people around him, and that comes through at the start of the book where you talk about when Mrs. Reagan passes away, and you all straight away go into almost an action mode, for want of a better phrase. So how do we make this happen? How do you support the wider family? How do you make sure that wishes and are adhered to? How do you make sure life is celebrated and so on? So many things you said about I'd like to unpack, if I may. You talk about the president's memoir, and in the book you talk about how you were there when he was doing the audio book sometimes as well. And I was just wondering, Peggy, that how did President Reagan see himself in American history? Did he talk about himself as having a significant role? Where did he see himself in that kind of like the saga or the arc of history in terms of the presidency and the development of the American story? And so if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Well, even with the fall of the wall, he spoke about that in language that indicated he always believed that the wall would fall. I think that maybe secretly he was surprised at how quickly it fell. But he always believed that communism was a system destined for the ash heap of history, he called it. It was basically a house of cards that was destined to collapse. And yet, to your point, he didn't necessarily see himself as being the architect of that. He honestly believed that once people got a taste of freedom, they couldn't help but want more. And so whether it was people across the world that he helped bring an end to communism, that he brought freedom to people all over the world, or whether it was in America where, in the 1970s, if you look historically, inflation was high, taxes were high, unemployment was high, American morale was incredibly low. It was like this era of malaise, they called it. And Ronald Reagan took office, and on day one, he started saying, it's morning in America. America's best days are ahead. There's a shining city on the hill, and we all get to be part of it. And so even here in America, he just saw that he was unleashing the ingenuity and the creativity and the drive of the American people. And at the end of his term, when you asked him what he was most proud of, he said, I made the American people believe in themselves again. So it was never about him. It was about him being a conduit or a facilitator for great things to happen. And in a way, he always saw government's role is to get out of the way of the American people, lower their taxes, lessen the regulations that they have, and allow them to experience freedom at its fullest, to pursue the capitalist goals of prosperity and success, and to provide jobs and innovation that changes the world and makes the world safer and smarter and better and healthier and all these things. And so he really saw that he was doing the role that he was put on earth to do. And if you were playing the role that you were put on earth to do, then we were all equal. And he really had this beautiful, humble spirit, although he had to have realized, of course, that his role was maybe a little bit more significant in a global scale than many of ours. But he really saw that he was just fulfilling the role he was put on here on earth to do.
Yeah, I think he often talks about in his speeches, remarks about how it's a stewardship. He doesn't see the presidency as his. He knows it's almost like it's not a permanent figure. He's kind of like passing through, wants to leave it in as a good a place as he possibly can.
He saw it as a privilege being bestowed upon him by the American people. And yeah, he called himself a temporary caretaker of the role. And he used to say after he returned to Los Angeles, he said, yeah, I've spent 8 years in government housing and now I'm out here on the West Coast unemployed looking for work. So he just had a great sense of that self-deprecating humor where he took the role seriously, but he didn't take himself too seriously. And I think that's part of the reason that he was so endearing, even to his critics. They may have hated some of his policies, but it was really hard to hate Ronald Reagan personally if you ever had a chance to meet him in person. He was very likable.
What did he miss about being president?
Not much. I will tell you that. In fact, it was funny. This story is told right after he had left the White House. He was driving in LA with Secret Service, of course, still driving him. And they were going across town and they stopped and they were just sitting there. And finally, the president leaned forward and he said, "Is everything okay?" And the Secret Service agent turned around to him in the back and he said, "I'm sorry, sir, the light is red." And here's a man who hadn't waited at a red light in 8 years. And it is 8 years as governor because, of course, the motorcade, they always clear the intersections ahead. And so not that he was complaining about it, he was concerned because why are we stopping while we're driving? So I love that story. So there were some adjustments that he had to make, but I think for the most part, he felt like he had done his duty in his public service, but he did really enjoy private life. He enjoyed being able to play golf more often, go to his ranch, spend more time with Mrs. Reagan, write and do the things that he wanted to do rather than having such a tightly scheduled day. Although we did keep him pretty busy in his post-presidency years, especially those first few years.
Of course, in those first few years as well, in terms of being busy, you mentioned he meets Mother Teresa, Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, among others. And in terms of Margaret Thatcher, in the book, there's a wonderful story about how when Margaret Thatcher goes to the ranch, and I think it goes exactly how people who remember Margaret Thatcher, study Margaret Thatcher, would expect it to have gone.
Full suit, scarf, handbag on her arm, yes, heels. So, yeah, she wasn't exactly ranch ready, but she came very proper as she always was. But it was funny because even though there was this formality in the way that she dressed, the president in the pictures, which are in the book, you'll see him in a flannel shirt and a big cowboy belt buckle and his jeans and boots. And that was the way he dressed at the ranch. Lady Thatcher was very proper and well-dressed, but beyond that, there was a warmth, there was a familiarity. She, as you may know, was very, I guess you would say, cheeky and funny and very witty. And she knew exactly what to say and how to say it to get him to just belly laugh, because she had that very dry wit. She would say it and keep a straight face, and President Reagan would be doubling over laughing. And so she just had this way about her that really got to him. And Mrs. Reagan very much enjoyed her company as well. And in fact, another one of my favorite pictures in the book is Lady Thatcher, Mrs. Reagan, and President Reagan, and they're all seated on a couch, and it's after a black tie event. And so the ladies are in these full-length evening gowns. They've got their shoes kicked off and they're in their stocking feet, and they each have a glass of wine and they're kind of leaning in, wrapped in conversation. And on the other end of the couch is Ronald Reagan in his full tuxedo, kind of slouched back, leaning his head back with his eyes rolled back of his head, like, come on, ladies, stop talking so we can go home. It's been a long evening. And so I love that moment because it just captures the humanity of these people. You picture them fully proper all the time. And yet here was a very personal, intimate moment that I captured of the three of them just enjoying a friendship, not the formalities of their.
Yeah, like the friendship rather than everything was wrapped up in the politics. Of course, Reagan and Thatcher had met in the 1975. I think that.
Right, long before she was prime minister and before he was president. Yeah. And they really hit it off. They had a kindred spirit. They politically aligned so well. Definitely had an emphasis on freedom and the desire to bring freedom to the world. And between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and I'd even add Pope John Paul II, was this triad of influence that really tackled the Cold War and tackled communism from their different spheres of influence. And when you look at historically, it's amazing. None of those three should have risen to power in the way that they did. You know, even Ronald Reagan, he wasn't the candidate in 1976, and in 1980, he wasn't the Republican Party's choice. George Bush was, and yet he was the people's choice. Margaret Thatcher has a very unlikely rise to power as well, as did Pope John Paul II. So you wind up with these three people, unlikely in the positions that they get in. And then, by the way, each one of them had an assassination attempt on their lives very early in their terms of leadership. And so any one of those three not only didn't make it to that place, but also didn't survive their term. And yet all three of them did. And they became this beautiful triad of influence that really put pressure on the world stage in ways that I think eventually, you know, revealed the cracks in communism and eventually helped the wall fall down and bring people freedom all over the world in places that they hadn't enjoyed it ever or in a very long time.
I also think because you had Mikhail Gorbachev instead, make it more of the Fantastic Four. I think there's a wonderful picture I've used. I've probably stole it off Google Images, I think, of the four of them, of like Thatcher, Reagan, the Pope, and Gorbachev, all in Fantastic Four costume. Just like, you know, how the coming together, all those, because they're all outsiders.
Right.
Reagan was an outsider
Yeah.
in terms of perhaps his career, outside of the mainstream Republican Party. He'd been talking for a long time about the same sort of ideas, really consistently.
Right.
Thatcher, of course, was the outsider of the first one prime minister. Almost like accidentally becomes conservative leader because she's not Edward Heath, who's the incumbent. And of course the Polish Pope. And then Gorbachev is very much almost like the Pete Warwood is in the audience, will know more than me, but it's almost like in some ways not the traditional. As far as I can tell, Soviet.
Right.
It's not like the next grey-haired man whose turn it was.
Right, exactly. Well, and Reagan used to joke about, I hope one of these Russian leaders lives long enough for me to actually have a conversation with him, because Ronald Reagan, he was a believer in freedom and he was anti-communist for decades, and so people picture him as president fighting communism, but it really goes back to his days as president of the Screen Actors Guild, when there was the Red Scare in Hollywood and they thought there was this overwhelming infiltration of Russia into the Hollywood studios. And so as president of the Screen Actors Guild, he was really responsible for determining who was a communist sympathizer, who wasn't. And in fact, I won't go into it now, but that's how he meets Nancy Davis, because there were two Nancy Davises, and one was accused of being a communist sympathizer and she was not, and she wanted this distinction. And so that's how they originally met. But back to those days, he had been speaking out against that. And so finally he gets into office and he really wants to sit down face to face and talk to the Soviet leader, because whether it was the Soviet leader or anybody else, he believed that as much as we disagree about things, there's always a few things we agree upon. And so let's start with that and then build a relationship from there on the things that we agree upon. And he gets into office, and I think Brezhnev was the Soviet leader and dies, and then Andropov dies, and then Chernenko dies. And he's like, how am I ever going to talk to a Soviet leader if they keep dying on me? So eventually, Gorbachev, this, of course, very much younger man, succeeds in power. And finally, he gets that chance to sit down and talk with him. And those incredible images of the two of them sitting fireside in that little boathouse in Geneva. And what a moment that we never thought we would see. And yet it was the beginning of what would eventually become a friendship. And, he exposed the cracks in communism and he gave Gorbachev a graceful exit. So Gorbachev wound up getting a lot of credit for ending the Cold War, but, he knew he was backed into a corner. He knew there was no escape, and Reagan, Thatcher, and even the Pope, I think, gave Gorbachev a graceful exit that was inevitable.
I think in Reagan's diary, he calls Gorbachev Gorby, which I love. And I think, also Reagan watches Star Trek 3, I think, with Gorby as well. I can't remember, but he calls him, which is great. But how was the relationship with Gorbachev after being in power? Because obviously, and how does he feel about Gorbachev being ejected from power?
Yeah.
How does that all play out?
Yeah, well, I didn't meet Gorbachev until post-presidency, and he was no longer the Soviet leader. And so I got to see these two men really just enjoying a friendship as best as you could. It's always a little hard with a translator. So somebody, like Margaret Thatcher, of course, he had a much closer and more personal relationship without that language barrier. But Gorbachev came up to his ranch. He was given the Reagan Freedom Award. Ronald Reagan tried to pay tribute to him and thank him for allowing his people to experience freedom that they hadn't experienced in a long time. And so he was very gracious and magnanimous about that and welcomed Gorbachev as a friend. So it was almost not as if the past hadn't happened, but wanted to reward and acknowledge the fact that he had had a change of heart that had brought so much good to his people. And so there was not a lot of reflection on the past. I think there was more a looking forward of both talking about freedom and both talking about the benefits of people who live under freedom.
Thank you. You've mentioned Mrs. Reagan obviously a few times, and in telling in your book how close you were to Mrs. Reagan, and a big part she was in your family's life as well. And what was Mrs. Reagan like? So I think sometimes in this type of conversation, it's very easy to forget the First Lady,
right.
Not on purpose, but obviously don't perhaps give them enough attention as they deserve. And what was she like? And because in the book you talk about how she kind of manages the office, a lot to go inter-office politics, because the president, we want to get into that. And that's kind of the impression you get about the White House as well, that the president really want to get too involved in kind of personnel disputes. And Mrs. Reagan would kind of softly step in to sort. So what was she like as a person? What was she like to work with or work for? And how influential was she in the president's career and his life?
Well, she was essential. And I actually don't think we would have had the Ronald Reagan we had if we didn't have the Nancy Reagan we had. And she took a lot of criticism and she was accused of a lot of terrible things. A lot of people really didn't like her. They probably didn't know her, but thought they didn't like her. And so she often was willing to be the bad guy, though, so that he could be the good guy. And she took on that role willingly because his legacy, his ability to do his job and not be distracted by all these other things. She was willing to take a lot of that fire so that he didn't have to. And so she was his biggest champion and fan. The two of them, their love story was so beautiful. And you would never see the two of them together without holding hands or his arm around her, or they'd be across the room from each other at an event and you'd see him kind of, putting eyes on her across the event and just changing his whole face when she would walk back over to him. And they truly were in love. They truly supported each other, appreciated each other, and were just a really incredible couple. As for my relationship with Mrs. Reagan, I mean, you can imagine a very young woman coming to work for her husband, how that could lend itself to some problems, but she was so supportive. She was such a great mentor to me. I learned so much from her. I watched how she did things. I listened to the questions she asked. I had a very open relationship with her. So I would sometimes just ask her, I don't know who this person is. Who is this person? Why are they important to the president? And, help me get this right. And she was always gracious with that. And I learned early on, I think there was two things that she wanted to know about the people who served her husband. One, were they loyal? And she knew I was extremely loyal. I had no other agenda other than to make sure that his days went well and that his legacy was preserved. And I would go to any lengths needed to ensure that to the best of my ability. And then the other thing she cared about was truth. She wanted to know that she would always hear the truth, that you would tell her the truth, the whole truth, even when it was difficult. And so sometimes I would call her and say, Mrs. Reagan, I hate to call and tell you this, but, and I would tell her, and then you would just leave it at that. I didn't need to fix it. I didn't need to solve it sometimes. But she wanted transparency because she cared about him. She cared about how his day was, how things went, and, who he was surrounded with. And so sometimes I had to have those difficult conversations with her. And, here's the woman who's been First Lady of the state of California for 8 years and of the United States for 8 years. And I'm in my 20s, fresh out of college. I'm sure I made a million dumb mistakes. And she was always very supportive and helpful to teach me and guide me, not criticize me. And so I was very grateful for that. And so appreciative that, especially in the president's later years, after I was no longer working in the office, when the president was at home full time, she had a very open door policy and would invite me to come up to the house to sit with him, to visit with him. And even after he passed away, she had a very open door and would call me every now and then say, I haven't seen you and the kids in a while. Will you please come by? And so to really have that friendship and that bond with her, she knew we were both totally committed to her husband, and she knew that that's where my loyalties lie, was with him.
And I think also as well, a great thing in the book is you talk about the gifts and the letters and the gifts that the president receives. And are there any particular ones that kind of like stick out in your memory of gifts or letters or anything like that which President Reagan received?
Well, he and your queen were great correspondents, your former queen, and my sympathies on her recent passing. She was a marvelous woman. They were frequent pen pals, as was the Queen Mom actually wrote to Ronald Reagan quite a bit as well. I never knew who was going to call on the phone or send a letter. And so that was always exciting to answer the phone or open the mail and see what was there. Gifts were very important to President Reagan. So whether people were coming into the office, a lot of times he would give them a colorful jar of jelly beans with the presidential seal on it. Sometimes there were other things. I write in my book about one of my biggest challenges gift-wise was Gorbachev was going up to the ranch and Ronald Reagan said, I think we should give him a Stetson cowboy hat. And I said, okay, great. I'm happy to do that. And then the moment I left President Reagan's office, I'm thinking, okay, how do I know what size hat Gorbachev wears? And, you know, back in the day, you couldn't just Google these things. And also, I live in Los Angeles. There's not many cowboy hats there. And so I write in my book in great detail about trying to figure out how exactly I determine what Gorbachev's hat size is. I get a Russian number that I have to convert to a Western number. And then where do you even find a cowboy hat? I finally went to an equestrian center in Los Angeles and found one. And then the drum roll of nerves as Gorbachev pulls it out of the box at the ranch. He's going to put it on, you know, the world media is there. He puts on the hat and thankfully it fit perfectly. So I was very proud of myself, kind of patting myself on the back until the next day Stetson called and said, we're so glad to see our hat featured so prominently on Gorbachev's head, but do you know he put it on backwards? Which I didn't know. I'm not a cowgirl. I was in charge of getting the hat, not putting it on his head.
Well, it sounds to me, Peggy, you could have done really well in the State Department in terms of diplomacy.
You know, and we didn't have the backing of the State Department and all these resources that he had when he was president. So it was actually just a young girl trying to be scrappy and figure these things out and hope and pray she got it right. And so to your point, my book it very much is a personal story. A lot of people can't relate to being president of the United States, but everybody can relate to a part of my story, being young and green and stepping into the work environment for the first time and feeling completely unqualified to be there, and yet eventually finding my footing and feeling like I belonged there and that I did actually have things to contribute. And then as a young woman trying to juggle family life, young kids with the professional arena, dealing with the death of my father, dealing with the president's diagnosis of Alzheimer's, you know, real life stories that everybody can relate to part of that story, even though we can't really relate to what it's like to be president of the United States. So I really do think there's something for everybody, and hopefully an encouragement to young people who are part of your class and who are stepping into the professional arena themselves for the first time. Dream big. Somebody's got to have the job you want. It might as well.
That leads to my final question before I hand it over to the two others, if I want to ask you anything, is that what advice would Peggy Grande, but also what advice would Ronald Reagan give to young people starting out thinking about next steps after what we want, college or university, we call it, and looking for their first job or career plans? What kind of advice would Ronald Reagan give? What would you give, or did you learn from the Reagans about doing that?
Yeah, I would definitely say dream big, and I guess lean into whatever opportunities come. You know, I've had a lot of people over the years say, oh, Peggy, you were so lucky. Well, luck maybe had something to do with it, but also I dreamed big. I took the initiative. I wrote a letter to the office of Ronald Reagan imagining that I would never even hear from them. But had I not taken the initiative and written that letter, they would have never found me. They would have never known that I would have loved to work for Ronald Reagan. And so you have to take initiative. Life will not come to you. And then, by the way, when you get those opportunities, take them, grab them, run with them as long and as best as you possibly can. Over the course of my term in the president's office, there was probably 100 interns that came through, and I was one of only a few that wound up staying. And so I could have gone in, said, oh, this internship is for 3 months, and the last month been kind of on my exit, on my way out, looking for other jobs and stuff. But no, I took on more responsibility. I spent more hours there. I wanted to learn how my little part that I was playing fit into the puzzle piece of the rest of the office work. And so I tried to learn as much as I could and lean into the work, rather than backing away from the work. And so that opened doors of opportunity. And so luck may have a little bit to do with it, but I think you really have to show initiative. And when those opportunities of benefit come to you, be ready to grab them. I wasn't necessarily skilled to work for the President of the United States, but I had gone to university, I had studied communications, I had done well, I had honed my skills, I had worked on being a good writer. And so I was ready to deploy those skills, and I did them to the best of my ability, always trying to do even more than they asked, and show up early and stay late and volunteer to take on other tasks. And so I think we create our own luck a little bit in life. And so when you get those opportunities, start by dreaming big. And then when you get that chance, lean into it, make the most of it. And really even that helped as well when later I had children. I had 3 of my 4 children while I was working for President Reagan. And this was back in the day that your job wasn't protected. If you were a pregnant woman and you were leaving to have a baby, then they could replace you easily. They didn't owe you anything. And so I think by leaning into my career, by making myself more valuable to them and to the office, when I had my first baby, they said, well, we hope you're coming back. When will you come back? How can we accommodate you? How can we get you to come back? And so that was the relationship I had with them each time. And so rather than pulling away and leaning out because I'm going to have babies and have a family, I continued to throttle forward. And I think that played out really well for the rest of my career.
Thank you, Peggy. And I think I won't be selfish anymore and monopolise all your time. I'm not quite sure how long we have. Maybe about 10 minutes or so left of your time, I think, for the hour. But any questions from our audience? Okay, Natasha Gibson, one of our students. She asked, firstly, I would like to say that, Peggy, you look fabulous. I'm very excited to be here. I just wanted to ask, what would you say was the hardest challenge you faced whilst working with Ronald Reagan, and how did you face those challenges?
Well, thank you for the question. I think every day was hard in a way. At the beginning, it was hard because I wanted to get everything right. And I didn't feel like he put pressure on me, but I put that pressure on myself. Here was a man who had stood on the world stage, who had been served by hundreds, if not thousands of people who were experienced and skilled and savvy. And here I was, young and green and trying to do my best. And so I never wanted to disappoint him or let him down or embarrass him, and certainly never wanted to put him in harm's way, because every movement we made was choreographed carefully with the United States Secret Service. And so was I communicating properly, and was I sharing everything that needed to be known so that he would be safe and protected, and then also his legacy and his reputation would be preserved? And so that was the pressure I put on myself every day. And then, of course, the heart piece came later. He announces he has Alzheimer's, and I'm working for this man that I personally care about so much. Even though we're in a professional relationship, I'm personally attached to him, and to know that I'm going to lose him and have to say goodbye to him. He and Mrs. Reagan, though, were so brave and strong, and I think they gave me the strength that I needed to face every day and to allow him to live as much of life as long as he could, as best as he could, as fully as he could, even though lurking in the background was always this dark cloud and this shadow that I knew was coming. And so I would say, in a way, every day was hard, but hard in a way that I loved, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. I think that destiny had me headed toward that job, and it was a job I loved and will forever treasure.
Thank you, Peggy. And Another question or two coming in as well. One from Robbie. Robbie Barnes is one of our historians here, saying thank you, Peggy. He's asking, no, we're not going to get too deep into politics and policy, especially contemporary ones, but he wants, did Reagan continue to pay attention to how Russia developed after the Cold War? So was he looking closely at how Russia was developing, changes happened there during the 1990s, and what do you think he would have made of the Ukraine war? What would his view, what might he have thought there?
Yeah. Well, he always believes in freedom. He believes that people should be free and have the right to govern themselves in the way that they see fit. You know, I always think that if Ronald Reagan was president, a lot of these things that we're facing in the world wouldn't happen. You know, his posture was always peace through strength. And that was a deterrent model more than anything. He wanted to not only use strong language, but have the capacity to back up those words with action if needed, and to have the respect on the world stage that people knew that he meant what he said. And, you know, when he came into office, it was interesting because people always dismissed him as this cowboy actor. And they forget the fact that he was governor of the state of California for 8 years, which is in essence the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. And so that was not a small task, but they always, you know, threw him off a little bit. It shrugged him off as a joke. He was an actor. But I think early in his presidency, he really changed the perspective on that. We had an air traffic controllers strike, and he had always been a union person and supported unions, but it was against their contract and they weren't allowed to go on strike. And he, in essence, gave them a deadline and said, if you don't return to work by this date, you will all be fired. And they didn't believe him. And the date came and the date went, and he fired them all the air traffic controllers who were part of this union who did not return to work. And so I think very early in his term, that set the foundation for not only domestically, but for the rest of the world. They knew he was not just a cowboy actor, but he was a political force to be reckoned with. And when he spoke, he meant it. And when he made a promise about something, he was going to do it. And so I think very early on, people learned that, okay, we need to sit up, we need to pay attention. And not only were the PATCO leaders paying attention, I think the leaders in Russia and worldwide were also watching as well, believing that he was truly a man of principle and resolve and would follow through.
Yeah, certainly Jeffrey Smith, who was a journalist, I think, for the Times, and he wrote one of the first book about Reagan and Thatcher, and he refers to PATCO as being Reagan sending a signal,
right?
And then kind of Thatcher picking up on that as well for some of her decisions as well, towards and other union action and so on.
Yeah.
But I think also, just from one of our students on our Reagan module, our Reagan course, is from Freddie. Freddie asks us, that says, thanks, Peggy. Did the Chernobyl disaster have any impact upon Reagan's perspective towards the Soviet Union?
I don't know. I wish I had a good answer to that. I really don't. It was not something we ever spoke about, you know, so I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that, Freddie.
That's okay. It's a very, very specific one. Another student of ours, Bailey's doing a PhD on presidential doctrine from Reagan through to George Bush Jr. He's just wondering, in some ways, I suppose, if we can kind of adapt still Bailey's question, Margaret Thatcher often said that her greatest achievement was Tony Blair. The fact the Labour Party changed and accepted so much of, you could say, the Thatcherite settlement, especially because of economic policy from the 1980s, early 1990s. Did Reagan ever, so obviously Reagan left them, Reagan always said the Democratic Party left him.
Right.
Did he ever take any satisfaction from the fact that perhaps a new generation of Democrats emerged, like Bill Clinton, perhaps more centrist? Did he ever take any kind of satisfaction that fact that maybe he's won the battle of ideas, anything like that? Did he ever, or was he just far too discreet to comment on his successes?
I mean, I guess I would answer that by saying he was principled first and partisan or party loyal second. And so he saw himself as a man of principles that really did not change over the years. And, you know, to your point, he was registered a Democrat for a long time. He was raised in a Democrat household. He voted for FDR, you know, the big government president here. And so eventually he did leave the Democrat Party saying, I didn't leave the party left me. He felt like they went too far left. And so he retained basically the same principles. He loved freedom. He wanted government to get out of the way of people. He believed that we, the people, tell the government what to do, not the other way around. And so his principles didn't really waver. And so he didn't care whether you were a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, whether you weren't even registered to vote. He was a man of principle. And so if you were aligned on principle, I don't think he really cared what your party was. But to your point, Bill Clinton, in a lot of ways, I think Ronald Reagan was a very pivotal president. So you wind up with the Carter years, you've got malaise, you've got American decline, America's best days are behind us feeling. Ronald Reagan pivots and changes all that, and the economy goes gangbusters. And, even at the G7, Helmut Kohl says, Ron, tell us about the American miracle. And a lot of places across the world, I think, started implementing these tax cuts, the lowering of regulations. And so in a way, I would say from Reagan to Bush 41 to Clinton to Bush 43, there was kind of this continuum in a lot of ways of the Reagan era policies. And then, I would say Obama was another pivotal leader that kind of really shifted the country in a different direction. And I think maybe why some of America and the world had so much whiplash is Donald Trump was again a pivotal leader. So we kind of did this back and forth really quickly in really drastic ways. And so I think that typically we have these eras. And so the Reagan era did, to your point, continue in a lot of ways, even through the Clinton timeframe.
Of course, finally, there was a balanced budget in
right.
in the 90s of when Bill Clinton also the
right. And at the time, we thought he was so radical. And now we look back and say, oh, he was actually, by comparison, pretty conservative to a lot of what we see now.
Yes, obviously, Republicans are in Congress, obviously they could take credit as well. Right. As Ronald Reagan would say, it doesn't matter what you can achieve, as long as no one cares who takes the credit.
Who gets the credit? Right, very good.
Got time for 2 more questions, Peggy?
Great. Yep, I do. Thank you.
Okay. From Alex, one of our students on our Reagan course, asking, did the president have any kind of did he wish any kind of missed opportunities as president? Did he ever look back and think, I was proud of that went well, or I wish I'd done more of that. I wish I said more of that. Was there anything you look back on as a missed opportunity? Anything like that at all?
Yeah, and he wasn't one to look back with a lot of regret, but he even writes about in his memoir when he was talking about immigration and some of the policies that he implemented. He made some of the changes that he made with the promise that on the back end, some other things would be done. And like often happens in politics, the follow-up wasn't followed up. And so he really felt in a lot of ways that he had opened the door to policy that was bad. That was never his intention, because he thought that, those who had also made promises to do their part would. And so I would say that that's probably one thing that he looked back and thought, that didn't play out the way that I wanted. But sometimes that's how things go. And I think he definitely learned from that, but maybe would have done that differently the next time around.
If I could speak to President Reagan, I'd say in his first term, I think he was very well served in terms by the people around him when he had Meese, Baker, Diva, and who really kind of pushed his agenda and got his agenda through a Democratic House of Representatives. Tip O'Neill's astonished about how successful he did.
Right.
After the second term, things don't go so well with the people around him, which of course causes all sorts of problems for the administration.
Right.
Where I think some would say that he was let down by some of the people who were around him. I think in his second term. But this might well be a nice, good, fun question to end on. Actually, Peggy, is Aidan, one of our politics and international relations students. He says, "This has been great, Peggy. Thank you. Quick question: did President Reagan talk movies much, and did he find time to watch a lot of cinema or movies in the 80s and in the 90s?"
Well, thank you, Aiden, for the question. And actually, a very fond memory I have is if you've ever seen the movie Die Hard, the very first one with Bruce Willis. So it takes place in Nakatomi Towers. And Nakatomi Towers is actually the building, the Fox Plaza building that we had our offices in. We had the entire 34th floor, which was the top working floor of that office. And so if you ever see Die Hard, walking into the building, that's the entrance of the building. The elevators that they use are the elevators there, the parking garage, so there's so many elements of that movie. And then of course, in the movie, you see the building gets all blown up and all of these things. Well, there's a scene in there where Bruce Willis is bleeding and he's sitting like on the bathroom sink trying to, heal, patch up his wounds or something. That's actually President Reagan's personal bathroom. And they filmed this movie before the building was completed. And so once it was completed, of course, it was beautiful. So we watched when this came out, and this is how old I am. I think it was on VCR. Probably we watched it in the office with President Reagan. And as they're blowing up this building, he kept looking around saying, they did a pretty good job putting this place all back together. And then, Bruce Willis is bleeding. Everybody's like, is that my bathroom? And so anyway, he always did love the movies. He much preferred the old movies where there was happy endings and there was a hero and those kind of things. But he did enjoy watching the movies. And it was funny because over the years, we had a lot of movie stars come in and, even Tom Cruise came in. And it was one of those funny moments because all these people that most people would be so nervous to meet, even somebody like Tom Cruise would come in and kind of clutch my arm, Peggy, what am I supposed to say or do? I'm so nervous. I want to get this right. And, here's somebody that most people would be nervous to meet, but they in turn were nervous to meet Ronald Reagan. So yeah, he was a movie buff. He loved the movies, but he always preferred a happy ending.
Well, I think it's probably far too soon in the calendar year to get into whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie or not. I think that's a good one.
I don't know why it's a Christmas movie, but yeah.
is it counts Christmas movie or not? I think it's not got to Halloween yet, so let's talk about what counts a Christmas movie. I think in due course. But I think, Peggy, we've taken up enough of your valuable time. Thank you ever so much for agreeing to do this. So many of our students have turned out from the Reagan module, which is great to see. So thank you to them, and also great to see so many colleagues as well, and people from outside of the Reagan module coming along too. So thank you.
Well, if I can end with one quick comment, I always love to end with a Reagan quote because he summed it up always so well. And in one of his last public speeches he gave in 1992, it was at the Houston Republican National Convention. He said to us, whatever else history may say about me when I'm gone, may it say that I appealed to your best hopes, not your worst fears, to your confidence rather than your doubt. And when we think of politics today, so much of it is about doubt and fear and division. And we think of it as being very toxic. And he didn't want it to be that way. He said, politics is an arena where we can appeal to the best hopes and to the confidence of everybody. And so whether you go into the political arena, historical arena, or whatever job you pursue, we all as leaders have an opportunity to appeal to the best hopes and the confidence of people around us rather than fear and doubt. And so I think he left us with some beautiful words. I appreciate everybody taking time to log in today. Please feel free to reach out to me on social media. If you pick up my book and pop me a message, I'm happy to send you a signed book plate for it. And if you do read it, I hope you will enjoy it. It's not a political or a partisan book. It really is a personal story of a woman who had a front row seat to history and considers herself the luckiest woman in the world to have had a seat there.
Well, I think we're very lucky to have had your time today, Peggy. So thank you ever so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for agreeing to do it. And on behalf of our students, thank you very, very much.